Did the Second Vatican Council teach anything infallibly? Are episcopal consecrations the highest form of holy orders? And was Vigano reconsecrated a bishop last November? Stick around to find out. One of the challenging things about being a content creator is sometimes you have to speak to a large audience and be aware that there are some people who are listening who are well formed in the faith and others who may not necessarily be so, and so you kind of have to be cognizant of how do you use terms and stuff like that. And sometimes it's important to use terms in a broad sense in the way that a larger amount of people would understand rather than very, very specific and technical terms, because that's certainly going to limit the ability to communicate to people in that broader audience. So sometimes it's important to use kind of accommodating language in such circumstances. Well, to that end, I often use terms that in some cases people would contest and may scruple over and say, actually, you should be using this other term. And in reality, in some cases, it's a both and. Let me give you a perfect example, which is going to introduce us to the topic today, whether the Second Vatican Council taught anything infallibly, whether or not episcopal consecration is the highest form of holy orders, and thus we can speak about it as episcopal ordination. And third, whether or not Vigano was reconsecrated, or what he thinks, conditionally consecrated, because perhaps in his mind, he questioned the validity of holy orders um, um, after the Second Vatican Council. So we're going to take a look at all these things, and you'll see from this comment that I received in the comment section why we're talking about it today. I get this comment often from people who they speak out of ignorance and they attempt to correct something that I say when they're painfully ignorant about the subject matter. Let me share my screen. This is a comment I just got earlier, but it's one among many. I've received this often in the last few days, and really the last few days isn't the only time I've heard this. Look at what this commenter says whenever I was commenting recently in a short, which can only be 60 seconds according to YouTube, so you don't have the time to qualify literally every single thing. Well, I made a short talking about how Vigano has gone through this consecration ceremony, questioning his previous ordination to the episcopate. And this commenter says, do you genuinely know nothing of the Catholic religion? I mean, so here's a very assertive person who's very confident of what they believe and of their position, and who thinks they're very informed on the topic of theology. We're going to see otherwise. One is not ordained a bishop. Huh? What? One is not ordained a bishop. They are consecrated a bishop. To my knowledge, nobody has claimed that Vigano sought conditional ordination, but only conditional consecration. Okay, I see this all the time, and I just have to say, look, this should be a moment where you learn, hey, maybe I should be a little bit more humble, and instead ask questions rather than directly assert. I think that people in this position should be less assertive and just say, hey, Michael, you mentioned that he was ordained, but I often hear the term is consecrated a bishop. Can you explain to me what's going on there? And I'll be like, yeah, absolutely. But when a person has this level of hubris, it's really hard to take them seriously and be respectful. Nonetheless, I'll still try. So let me address the issue, and let me address all three of those topics that I introduced to you. So you're going to get a 3 for today, right? Good old Southern term, not a 2 for, a 2 for 1. You're going to get a 3 for today. We're going to cover 3 things today, all because of this commenter. So let's actually start with, first of all, what the Second Vatican Council says, because this is often overlooked. I know I've spoken about it before in shows, but a lot of people haven't gotten the message. They didn't get the memo. So let's do it again. All right. So Lumen Gentium 21 says this. And the Sacred Council teaches. Now, let me stop there. Oh, but I thought this was just a pastoral council, Michael. Yeah, right. So being a pastoral council is not antithetical to teaching. They go hand in hand. You can teach in a pastoral way, right? So just because one says this is a pastoral council doesn't mean there are no teachings. Okay, and when you hear that language and the Sacred Council teaches, theologians will often point out, wait, that's relatively solemn language for the Second Vatican Council. And so what you're about to hear is going to be a solemn teaching. But I know there's going to be some objections to that. Hold your horses. I'll address them in a moment. And the Sacred Council teaches that by episcopal consecration, now there's that term, the fullness of the sacrament of orders is confirmed. What's orders? Holy orders. So what is this saying? It's saying that there are 3 degrees to holy orders, the sacrament of holy orders, the diaconate, presbyterate, and then the episcopate. The bishop is not just a glorified priest. He receives the fullness of holy orders. This is why we can actually speak of episcopal consecration as episcopal ordination. This is not a term that is unique to me. It's because it's rooted in this definitive teaching. And I'll touch on the question of whether or not it's definitive here in a moment, but it is a definitive teaching. So that you can see this is not unique to me. I'm not making this up. Even the Vatican uses this term. Holy Mass with episcopal ordinations. Now let's go back to that commenter. Let's go to him for a second here. Maybe he thinks the Vatican knows nothing about Catholicism and the Catholic religion. He might be one of those guys who actually thinks that. I don't know. There's some people out there who have that kind of arrogance. Well, do you genuinely know nothing of the Catholic religion? One is not ordained a bishop, they're consecrated a bishop, and yet their hubris has gotten them into trouble because the Second Vatican Council says otherwise. Episcopal consecration is episcopal ordination, and hence that is why you see the Vatican using terms like episcopal ordinations. And it's not just the Vatican, by the way. Here's from one of the largest archdioceses out there. This is going to be Los Angeles, Archdiocese of Los Angeles. Look at what it says here. Although already ordained priests, the bishops-elect will celebrate a 3rd and final degree of the sacrament of holy orders. The 3rd is episcopacy. The 3rd and final ordination will bring them into the fullness of the priesthood. And then it says, the Mass begins with the entrance of the ordaining bishop, consecrating bishops, the candidate for ordination, bishop select. So again, you can use either term to scruple over this and say, oh, no. You got to use episcopal consecration. You can't say episcopal ordination. There's a veiled theological error hidden behind that assertion, and that is a denial of what the Second Vatican Council is teaching, that episcopal consecration is the highest order or the fullness of holy orders. So there's an implicit theological error behind the person who scrupulously says, no, but you didn't use the word consecration. Don't you know? Stop. I see this excessively all the time. And I think it's a good teaching moment for us to learn, you know what? It's better for us to say, hey, I thought the appropriate term was episcopal consecration. You used episcopal ordination. Can you please explain? And then I'll say, yes, both terms are appropriate. They're synonyms because the church teaches the episcopate is not just a glorified aspect of the priesthood. It's not just the priesthood with some added jurisdiction, as some scholastics thought. No, the magisterium teaches it's the fullness of holy order. So I hope we've put that one to rest at this point. Although I suspect many people will still continue to engage in this level of hubris. And I'll just send them this video in the future. Now, I want to take a look at a number of things concerning whether or not the Second Vatican Council taught this definitively. Because it's undeniable, it teaches this, right? Because again, as I share my screen, the Second Vatican Council says, and the Sacred Council teaches. So you can't deny that this is a teaching. You can't say, oh, well, it's just an opinion. It's just a discipline. Or, no, it's very clearly an ecumenical council teaching. And so it's going to be authoritative. It's going to be binding on the conscience. But then what level is this binding? At what level is the teaching? Is this a dogma? Is it definitive Catholic doctrine? Or is it non-definitive Catholic doctrine? You see, there's those three grades to teachings that we have identified for us at the end of the Profession of Faith, 1989, promulgated by John Paul II. You're welcome to look up Profession of Faith online. I'll just do it real quickly here, just to cover all bases. Our Profession of Faith starts out, of course, with a recitation and an affirmation of the Nicene Creed. But then after that, you have, let me try to adjust that there. Okay. Then after that, you have 3 paragraphs. With firm faith, I believe everything contained in the Word of God, written or handed down, either by solemn judgment or the ordinary and universal magisterium set forth to be believed as divinely revealed. This is what you would call dogmas, that which has been revealed by God, either explicitly or implicitly, in sacred tradition or sacred scripture, and the church has confirmed it as such. You give divine and Catholic faith to it. These are dogmas. These are what's called primary objects, and in this case, primary objects of infallibility. All those are synonyms. So these are grade 1 teachings, the highest form of teaching, if you will. This is a dogma. So now you have to ask the question, okay, well, what Vatican II said there about the sacramentality of the episcopate, is this dogmatic? Is it there? Well, there's 2 other options. Also, there's the second grade of teaching, what we would call secondary objects, or definitive Catholic doctrine. And it says, I also firmly accept and hold each and everything definitively proposed by the church regarding teaching on faith and morals. Now, notice it's proposed by the church. It's not directly revealed by God, as the first level teachings are. This one is going to be a downgraded form of teaching because it's proposed by the church, not directly revealed by God. And then number 2, you'll notice they are, however, identified as definitive. Now, that which is proposed definitively by the magisterium has to also be infallible, because the church can't definitively bind your conscience to an error. Otherwise, the church would have defected from the faith and its teaching authority. Thus, first level teachings, dogmas, are clearly infallible. Second level teachings, definitive Catholic doctrine, secondary objects, are also, when they are taught definitively, just that, they're infallible. Okay, so that's a level 2 teaching, a little different than a level 1, because the source of the teaching in the case of a level 1 is God. The source of the teaching in the second case is something proposed by the church. And the reason why, by the way, the church can do this is because what they're proposing definitively is necessarily connected to a level 1 teaching, to a dogma. So if you were to deny one of these secondary objects, if you were to deny one of these teachings, you would end up necessarily denying a level 1 teaching, because there's a necessary relationship between them. Much, much more can be said there. I talk about this certainly in my magisterium courses, whether either here or elsewhere. I speak about it very often. Much more can be said, but just kind of giving a really quick summary so that we can have a little bit of foundation for the discussion. Okay, now, what Vatican II said, is it a level 2 teaching? Is it here? Or is it level 1? I'll answer the question, but let's consider the third option first. Moreover, I adhere with religious submission of intellect and will to the teachings which either the Pope or the College of Bishops enunciate when they exercise their authentic magisterium. Authentic means authoritative, even if they do not intend to proclaim these teachings by definitive act. By the way, some people have often misunderstood this, and they think that that means that these level 3 teachings are the only ones that are authentic, and level 2 and level 1 are not authentic or authoritative. No, everything that the magisterium teaches authoritatively is authentic, because authentic means authoritative. But what we could say is level 3 is merely authentic, what some people say, are merely ordinary magisterium. These are authentic acts of the magisterium that are not taught definitively, but are authentic acts of the magisterium that are taught non-definitively. And you can see that by even if they do not intend to proclaim these things by definitive act. So level 1 and level 2 are definitive, infallible. Level 3 are teachings of the church that are authoritative. They're binding on your conscience. You submit to them with submission of intellect and will. But you recognize these are not taught infallibly, and it could be that the church will revise this teaching later on. It likely won't, but it could be, because that which is non-definitive in nature could end up being modified. Okay, so which one is it? Level 1, level 2, level 3? All right, that's what we're exploring here. Well, when you take a look at something Paul VI said, something I've addressed numerous times and, of course, anticipated for the show. And you know what? Right before I even got on the air, we got a commenter who already falls into the trap. I mean, it's interesting how this continues to happen. All right, so this commenter says, of course, Lofton will say that it did teach, that is Vatican II, but even Paul VI said that it did not teach anything infallibly. Yeah, no, that's not what Paul VI said. But that is how a person who's not educated would read it. And that's, again, me being very blunt and frank, but sometimes people need to hear that. Again, these are one of those cases where you would do well to just say, hey, I understand that you're saying Vatican II teaches this definitively, but didn't Paul VI say some of this other stuff? How did those two things cohere? And I would say, thank you so much for asking. Wonderful question. Here's the answer. You would do well to do that rather than, again, assert based on ignorance. Let me show you what Paul VI actually said. He did not say nothing was taught infallibly. I've heard Taylor Marshall, from everyone from him on down, make this claim, and it's profoundly ignorant. This is something that Paul VI said at his closing speech to the Second Vatican Council. We're going to take a look at that, and also something that he said in a general audience. Okay, so Paul VI said, we prefer to point out how charity has been the principal religious feature of this council. No one can reprove as want of religion or infidelity to the gospel such a basic orientation when we recall that it is Christ himself who taught us that love for our brethren is the distinctive mark of his disciples. When we listen to the words of the apostle, let's see, hold on. I think I may have grabbed the wrong part. Yeah, there it is. Grabbed the wrong part. I think it moved because I zoomed in. All right, but one thing must be noted here, namely that the teaching authority, aka magisterium, of the church, even though not wishing to issue extraordinary dogmatic pronouncements, has made thoroughly known its authoritative teaching on a number of questions. So he's saying, well, Vatican II hasn't taught anything dogmatically, but it has taught some things authoritatively. So what does that tell you? All right, well, let's go back to that profession of faith one more time, and let's see what the options are here. Okay, so he says it hasn't taught anything dogmatically. Which one of these three levels of teaching has been eliminated now? Well, level 1 has been eliminated according to Paul VI, because level 1 is dogmas. Bam. Off the table. So it would be appropriate to say Vatican II didn't teach anything new dogmatically. Now, it does teach things dogmatically, but they were things that are already dogma prior to Vatican II. But they didn't exercise any kind of solemn teaching authority for dogmas. So level 1 is off the table. I think we can all agree on that one. So if we're speaking of the sacramentality of the episcopate, we all have to agree Okay, level 1 wasn't employed, but that leaves us two other options that are often overlooked here. Now, he did say it was authoritative teaching, so it's either level 2 or level 3, one of those. The difference is between definitive Catholic doctrine and non-definitive Catholic doctrine, level 2, level 3. So which one is it? In the case of a secondary object of infallibility, or secondary object, in this level 2 teaching, those are definitive. Therefore, they're infallible in nature. So if it's level 2, it is infallible. If it's level 3, it's not infallible necessarily. So to immediately jump the gun and say, but he said no new dogmas, and think that means no new infallible teachings, is to show one's profound ignorance. So again, our commenter here is very much representative of numerous people from Taylor Marshall on down who make this very argument. Dogmas are not the only things that are infallible. Secondary objects, definitive Catholic doctrine, are also infallible. However, they are not dogmas because they're not necessarily taught by God. They are taught by the church because they are necessarily connected to something taught by God. So this overly simplistic understanding of the magisterium has gotten us into trouble numerous times, and we're saying here is one example. Now, again, remains the question, which one is it? Level 2, level 3. One other quote, though, from Paul VI before I answer. This is from a general audience in 1966, so after the closing of the Second Vatican Council. This is the one that's often quoted by your Taylor Marshalls and your commenters in the chat. There are those who ask what authority, what theological qualification the council intended to give to its teachings, knowing that it avoided issuing solemn dogmatic definitions. Very specific terminology, right? Because, by the way, there are non-solemn dogmatic definitions, but there are also solemn dogmatic definitions. The difference is between whether or not the College of Bishops is teaching in an ecumenical council or as the ordinary and universal magisterium. That's the difference between solemn and non-solemn. Okay, but solemn Catholic doctrine? Nope. Solemn dogmas. So again, level 1 knocked off the table, but that doesn't address level 2, right? Okay. Engaging the infallibility of the ecclesiastical magisterium. In what sense? As dogmatic definitions. But he doesn't speak about engaging the infallible magisterium as far as secondary objects. He doesn't comment on that at all. The answer is known by whoever remembers the conciliar declaration of 64, repeated on November 1664. Given the council's pastoral character, it avoided pronouncing in an extraordinary manner dogmas endowed with the note of infallibility. That doesn't answer, but did it teach anything that is a secondary object definitively? He doesn't answer there. But we do know where else he did answer the question. Often overlooked because most people don't read the Acts of the Council. Let me show you from Dr. King's very helpful doctoral dissertation, The Authoritative Weight of Non-Definitive Magisterial Teachings. He notes this: for Paul VI's opening of the third session in 1964, he's opening the third session of the Second Vatican Council. In the Acts of the Council, he says something really interesting about Lumen Gentium 21 in the episcopate and sacramentality of the episcopate. He says, zoom in on it. The council's task is to bring certain troublesome theological controversies to a close. What is that controversy? Until the Second Vatican Council, it was debated whether or not the episcopate was the fullness of holy orders or whether or not it was just some glorified version of the priesthood. That was a debate. Probably that is one of the reasons why you see the prevalence of the term episcopal consecration as opposed to episcopal ordination, even though they're synonyms. You probably see the prevalence of that term because it's a throwback to this debate and those who would emphasize that episcopal consecration is not the fullness of holy orders. That's just my speculative opinion and theory as far as why that term is prevalent. But that they're synonyms has already been established. That's not in dispute. Now, they're going to bring something to a close. What are they bringing to a close? This debate on the sacramentality of the episcopate. It is the task to finally manifest to the faithful of the Catholic Church and to our brethren of brothers and sisters from separated communities, what is the true concept of the orders of the sacred hierarchy. And this is, again, not only settling it for us Catholics, but also to let everybody else know what we teach. Because, for instance, the Eastern Orthodox still debate this question. Is a bishop actually the fullness of holy orders or just a glorified priest? They still have that debate. Of which it is said, the Holy Spirit set up overseers, bishops, to govern the church. And indeed with a firm authority, which may not be called into doubt. That's interesting language. So we know whatever he says, whatever they teach here is going to be authoritative. It's either going to be a secondary object of infallibility or non-definitive Catholic doctrine, level 3 teaching. It's going to be one of those two, because we already know dogma is off the table. Now, that which is taught non-definitively as non-definitive Catholic doctrine, can that be called into doubt? Yeah, again. Yes, it can, because it's non-definitive in nature. Therefore, it is reformable. Secondary objects, level 2 teachings, can those be called into doubt? No, because they're taught irreformably, definitively, infallibly. So by process of elimination, let's walk through it one last time in the profession of faith. And let's do a process of elimination here. Process of elimination. What does that lead us with? Okay, well, dogmas are off the table, so that one's gone. Can't be called into doubt. Well, that would mean non-definitive Catholic doctrine is off the table. Which one's left here? Process of elimination. 2 out of 3 are knocked off the table. Which one's left? Oh, there you go. That one. I also firmly accept and hold each and everything definitively proposed by the Church regarding teaching of faith and morals. In other words, this is a secondary object of infallibility. Ergo, the Church at Vatican II did teach something infallibly. It just did not teach something dogmatic in nature. It taught something that is a secondary object infallibly. So again, full circle to our commenter here who represents many commenters. Paul VI said it didn't teach anything infallibly. Error. Absolutely wrong. He said it didn't teach anything dogmatically, and that is in a new way. Anything new that is dogmatic in nature. He did not say it did not teach anything infallibly. The sacramentality of the episcopate is one example where it did employ an infallible teaching. But it, of course, is a secondary object. I'll note, according to canon law, and even the Bertone and Ratzinger commentary on the concluding paragraphs of the Profession of Faith by the CDF at the time, I'll note that if a person denies one of these teachings, they do lack full communion with the Church. So even though you may not be a heretic if you deny this teaching, because heresy only pertains to a denial of dogma, you will still be engaging in an error in ecclesiastical faith, and therefore you would still be placing yourself outside of the fullness of the Church to deny these teachings. So it is binding on one's conscience to give that secondary level of assent that we saw in the Profession of Faith to this proposition. Therefore, whenever you have snide commenters who say, well, don't you know the Catholic religion, episcopal consecration is not episcopal ordination, there's a veiled theological error there that if one does so knowingly, and I'm not saying this commenter does, I don't know his level of culpability, but for those who know better, then that does impair their communion with the Church. because the error is so severe, because this is a definitive teaching. So these kinds of comments aren't helpful. I find them profoundly ignorant, but I find them to be incredibly common. So what we've seen so far, episcopal consecration is a synonym for episcopal ordination. Episcopal ordination is a term the Vatican uses, and many dioceses throughout the world use the same term. They also use episcopal consecration because they're synonyms. So you can't say, oh, you have to use this particular term. I suspect the person is saying that because they're not aware of this teaching of the Second Vatican Council. Number two, we established that that teaching is definitive. Therefore, it is an infallible teaching of the Second Vatican Council. We've established that one. That leaves us with one final question to explore here, the thing that really precipitated this whole conversation, and that is Vigano, and whether or not he has undergone a conditional ordination or conditional consecration, whichever term you want to use. Don't be a Pharisee. It's either one is appropriate. Conditional consecration or conditional ordination would be a service that one would undergo if they doubt their previous ordination. So if they think that, I don't know if I was validly ordained before, it's really in doubt, you would go through this ceremony or service. In the same way, when we speak of baptism, you can only be baptized one time. But if there is a doubt about the validity of baptism, you can't be rebaptized, but you could be conditionally baptized. So that if the first one was valid, this one isn't. If the first one wasn't valid, this one is. Now, in common use of terms, whenever you're speaking to a broad audience, sometimes you can't always just use the most technical terms. You have to speak in a very broad fashion. So I spoke recently in a 60-second short. Again, you can only speak up to 60 seconds in a short on YouTube. So I don't have a lot of time, and it's very broad in its audience. So I spoke briefly about Vigano being reordained. Okay, and that's what precipitated this hubris comment from multiple people. Well, hey, oh no, it's consecration, not ordination. Error. And then number two, I saw a lot of commenters say, you can't be reordained. What are you talking about, Michael? I know you can't be reordained. I understand that. If you're validly ordained, you can't be ordained again. I understand that. It's a common way of speaking in the same way that we speak of rebaptism. You can't be rebaptized, but you can attempt to be. So when a person who's validly baptized, let's say a person who's baptized as an infant, and then they join a Protestant circle later on, a Protestant community, and they go to get baptized again, is that a rebaptism? Technically, no, because they've already been baptized. But in common way of speaking, we call it rebaptism. And we would say it's sacrilegious because you've already been baptized. That's what I'm referring to when I speak of Vigano being reordained. I don't believe that he can be reordained. I'm using common speech that is going to make sense to most people in a context where I only have 60 seconds to speak. So it's incredibly pharisaical and ridiculous to hone in on these scrupulous points and ignore the bigger issue here, and that is Vigano has seriously put into question his own ordination to the episcopate. That's the problem. That's what we should be focused on, not these ridiculously scrupulous conversations and nitpicking language. That's the issue. Now, whether or not this happened, I think has been thoroughly established. There have been numerous reports by friends and foes of Vigano from many communities affirming that in November in Rome, he was conditionally consecrated or conditionally ordained by Bishop Williamson, who's not in communion with the Catholic Church, formerly part of the SSPX. Benedict lifted his excommunication, and then he got excommunicated again because he consecrated more bishops shortly thereafter. Very controversial figure. I knew about his association with Bishop Williamson before any of this erupted. So I wasn't surprised to see whenever this information became public. But numerous sources at this point have reported that he has been reconsecrated. And that would make sense from his perspective, because he already doesn't believe the authority of the Second Vatican Council. So why would he believe in the authority of the new rite of ordination that derived from it? Usually people who reject the Second Vatican Council, usually, if they're consistent, I'm not saying everybody's consistent, but if they're consistent, they will reject the new rite of ordination and its validity. And thus, they will look for holy orders from a preconciliar rite and from someone who has a lineage through the preconciliar rite of ordination. This is generally what the sedevacantists do. Since he has become a sedevacantist, it totally makes sense for him to do this. Now, he's wrong. It's wrong. He was already validly ordained a bishop. He's wrong to, go through this ceremony. But from his perspective, if he's right, okay, it does make sense. So it's hardly controversial to even point this out at this point. And then number two, I'll also add, to this day, he hasn't denied it when the news has been massive. So that already tells you, look, this happened. It's been established. Here's just one of numerous sources. Vigano switches to Bishop Williamson's camp. Vigano, former nuncio in the United States and a radical conservative critic of Pope Francis for years, has apparently joined the sedevacantists. Not apparently. Maybe at the time of this report it was apparent. Apparently, this was what? Let's see here. Not long ago. So this was January 17th of 2024 is when they published that. Now, it was already apparent that he had joined the sedevacantists by then, so I would tweak that part, but whatever. Several traditionalist blogs report that he has already had himself reconsecrated as a bishop conditionally in 2023 by the English Bishop Williamson. By the way, that also is an automatic excommunication if you do this, for him as well. In other words, Vigano was already automatically excommunicated when he became a sedevacantist. We know that was several years ago. He excommunicated himself. But even if he didn't, well, he definitely excommunicated himself when he did this. So there's a lot of things that Vigano has done to excommunicate himself. So when people say silly things like Pope Francis was so quick to excommunicate him, he didn't excommunicate him. He just said that he had already been excommunicated at the time of the crime, which was like 2 years, maybe ago, somewhere around that 2 years ago. Dude's been excommunicated for a long time. What are you talking about? All right. Who was expelled from the Society of St. Pius X, Williamson. The episcopal consecration conditionally assumes that the previous episcopal consecration, Vigano was consecrated bishop in 92, was possibly invalid. Yeah. There it is. Yep. And again, notice that Vigano will not come out and say, hey, guys, this never happened. Hey, if he does, I'd be so happy to set the record straight and come out and say, oh, guys, I'm so happy. Actually, he didn't reconsecrate himself. So how does that work for you guys who completely reject the Second Vatican Council? Y'all still on board with this guy because he's going with his ordination that traces back to the Second Vatican Council and its rite of ordination? How's that work for you guys? So either way, it's going to be bad for the veganists. But yeah, he hasn't come out and denied it. And I think we know why, because it's pretty clear. He's already done it. So there it is. I was shocked by how many people in the comment section kept saying, what are you talking about? I have no idea what you're referring to. Now you know. There it is. Everybody hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Check me out at patreon.com/reason and theology, reason and theology, if you want to support this channel. See you later. God bless. For years, I've tirelessly defended the Catholic magisterium, despite pushback from numerous people slandering this ministry, misrepresenting it, and calling for its cancellation. Our situation today is very similar to the days of St. Maximus the Confessor, who was constantly pressured to deviate from the teachings of Rome and embrace the heresies that many other bishops were promoting. He was exiled, ridiculed, slandered, but he stood fast despite this persecution, which also included the imperial court of Constantinople Constantinople cutting off his arm and ripping out his tongue so that he could no longer write the truth and speak the truth. It can be costly to speak the truth and defend the papacy in an age that is so hostile towards it, just like during the days of St. Maximus. But this is what we are called to do. This is the faith and tradition of our forefathers. I plead for all Catholics to stand up for our church and defend it. And consider supporting this channel that has been vindicated by Rome's decisions time after time again. You can do that by subscribing and supporting this ministry at patreon.com/Reason in Theology or reasonintheology.locals.com. There's also a PayPal and a GoFundMe link in the description of this video. God bless.